II have on the civil rights struggle in America?
Well, it's hard to deny the central importance of World War II on what we would define as the modern civil rights struggle. When you think of the movement with Martin Luther King, with Malcolm X, you have to think back to where those things began. And World War II is the point where a lot of folks are beginning to, a lot of historians are looking, saying, this is where the kind of modern civil rights spirit emerges. World War II brought profound change to America, not only for the nation as a whole, but for the African American population as well. You have black servicemen being drafted to serve in World War II. They're being asked to fight a war for liberty and freedom and helping out oppressed peoples throughout the world, and they live that dual role of being an oppressed person in the United States. So you see within the civil rights community itself in America this movement towards what folks were calling the Double V campaign during World War II. It's the idea of victory against tyranny overseas, but also victory at home against racial oppression. So you have a lot of folks kind of awakening to the problem which exists, which we're being oppressed, but as a nation we're participating in a war to liberate people. And it just didn't seem right to a lot of Americans. And you start to see a lot of folks in the black community begin to challenge the racial status quo that existed. It was very common for black servicemen who were in uniform to maybe challenge some of the local customs regarding segregation on public transportation. We see a lot more of that taking place. We see a lot of African Americans filling roles during World War II, which traditionally had been closed to them. As more and more folks get drafted, more and more people go and leave the country, you have job opportunities that are opened up now to the black population, which previously had been closed. So now they have access to new and different types of employment that brings a self of kind of personal upliftment and also a sense of, well, hey, I can do this. And I should be allowed to do this and continue to do this. So you really start to see momentum shifting in that direction amongst the individuals within the African American community, but you also see the federal government as well beginning to respond to the needs of the nation's black citizens, whereas before the government tended to take a more standoff approach. The classic example of this is the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which emerges in 1940 in part because Asa Philip Randolph, who is the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, he was going to organize this March on Washington. And the whole purpose of it was to raise awareness that African Americans in the North and the South are being denied access to employment in the defense industry. And even though we weren't at war yet, we were in that process of massive remobilization, rearming of our military in wake of the invasion of France and the fall of France. We invest billions of dollars in defense spending, and A. Philip Randolph said, we want a piece of this, and it's not fair that we're being denied this. So Franklin Roosevelt, in order to prevent that march in Washington from actually taking place, cuts a deal with A. Philip Randolph. Do not have this march on Washington, which will make America look bad in the eyes of the world, as we are supporting the English in their fight against Nazi tyranny, and here we are at home with a very large minority protesting oppression here. So it was in many ways a public relations issue for Franklin Roosevelt at the time. And of course his wife Eleanor was pressuring him to do something in the field of civil rights. So he sits down with Randolph and promises him that by executive order, I will create the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which will prohibit any further defense contracts from being issued unless there are non-discrimination clauses added to it. So the FEPC would oversee the non-discrimination clauses as defense contractors receive their payments from the federal government. So this is as well opens up a lot of doors for black Americans in the North and in the South as well. There were a lot of Southern companies up in Shreveport in Louisiana. There were several defense entities that decided, well, we're not going to abide by the spirit of the FEPC, and we're going to try to get these government contracts anyhow. And in essence, what happened was they were just shut out of the federal revenue. And there was thousands of dollars lost to places like Shreveport in the South, which refused to open up their employment to black workers.
What other impact did it have in Louisiana outside of the Shreveport example.
Okay. You know, in World War II in Louisiana, you can trace the awakening within the black community to the problems that exist. It's during World War II that we have black teachers, for example, kind of galvanized by the spirit of, you know, we're fighting oppression overseas and we're oppressed here. It starts with a group of East Baton Rouge Parish teachers, black teachers who were going to begin litigation because they were denied equal pay. And, you know, they wanted, you know, if we're going to have a system of segregation and the concept of separate but equal, there was this sense of, well, let's make it equal instead of having a white teacher salary scale and a black teacher salary scale. And throughout World War II, we see, you know, the NAACP getting involved with A.P. Thoreau here in Louisiana litigating on behalf of black school teachers to equalize pay. It doesn't become a reality during World War II, but shortly thereafter, the state of Louisiana does indeed equalize teacher pay for white and black teachers, but it's that awakening which emerges as a result of World War II. We also see episodes of violence on military bases, which was kind of and around military bases, which was pretty common in the Jim Crow South. You have a lot of black servicemen who, when they would go on leave, would go out to the local communities, and oftentimes trouble would result. The classic example of this took place in Alexandria in January of 1942. It was pay time. Soldiers got their pay, and they emptied the military bases, head to Alexandria to spend their money. And of course, since this was the segregated city of Alexandria, whites went to the white watering holes and blacks went to the black watering holes. And what happened in Alexandria in 1942 was what usually happens. You have a black MP would be assigned to the black community in Alexandria or wherever, just to make sure that if the troops, any of the soldiers got out of line, got too drunk, the black MP would handle that situation. But what happened in Alexandria this time was a black MP wasn't there, but 60 white police were there. And we're on Lee Street in Alexandria, which was part of the black community in Alexandria. So you have a lot of black soldiers up and down the street in the different bars and taverns that were available. And one of those soldiers was arrested by the white police officers for disorderly conduct. And what happened was some of his friends were there, and they started protesting, saying, this guy isn't doing anything. And tensions quickly escalated from there, where the white police were joined by state police, were joined by local police, and they just started indiscriminately shooting at black servicemen up and down Lee Street. Property is damaged all across the storefronts there on Lee Street. You have about 28 individuals who were shot as a result of the police action, 3 of whom were severely wounded in the gunplay. That's a major episode in Alexandria, but it's the kind of thing on a smaller level that happened day to day across Louisiana, where servicemen are going to begin that process of just challenging local customs, because a lot of these fellows were from other places. And like, wait, I'm wearing a uniform here. I'm a U.S. soldier. This isn't right. And you have those kind of day-to-day challenges and tensions which happened all the time. Are you interested in the white response or to that? Or?
Sure.
As a result of what happened in World War II, when you have just this awakening within the black community, we need to start challenging for our rights. We need to start demanding the rights that are ours constitutionally anyhow. You start to see a lot of white Southern politicians here in Louisiana, really emphasizing the race issue in their political campaigns. It becomes increasingly important in the 1940s and around World War II, where for a period a lot of the racial rhetoric among Southern politicians had died down because Jim Crow was the law of the land. Challenges to the system were few and far between, and you didn't need that constant emphasis on racial rhetoric. Really, from World War II on, you start to see a ramping up of that rhetoric until the very end of the 1960s, where you see Southern politicians really concerned about what World War II ultimately would mean in terms of their local communities. And you see, for example, Louisiana Senator Allen Ellender was, throughout World War II, very concerned and regularly expressed his concerns about what was going to happen in Southern communities when the draft took place and white Southern youth were taken away. As he said, white Southern manhood is going to be taken away and be drafted to fight overseas, and left behind is going to be the black population. And he started stressing those fears. How is this going to undermine our social order? What kind of chaos is going to result? What kind of violence is going to be produced because the status quo is now upset? So politicians like Ellinger really play to that idea. You get a lot of local politicians, regional politicians. I think of, for example, Mississippi's Theodore Bilbo, right down the road, who was regularly concerned about, what's going to happen now that the war is over. And the war is over, and we're going to have black servicemen returning, going back to their homes all across the South after having been on northern military bases, after having been exposed to more liberal European cultures, and then coming back to deep Southern communities where they're going to be asked to, go down a few steps in the social order. And Bilbo was portending all manner of racial discourse and trouble in Mississippi and across the South as a result. So there's this intensified concern amongst white Southern politicians about exactly what was going to happen because of World War II, because of the challenges to the social order that were taking place, that they could see all around them. And of course, you also have now the increasing strength of the federal government starting to weigh in on the civil rights question, even if it's only obliquely, like with the FEPC. It establishes this powerful federal precedent of interfering in state affairs or interfering with, the whole hiring system, at least in the defense industry, and folks saw that as, well, maybe this is a sign of what's going to happen down the line after the war. And true enough, when you think of the post-World War II environment, you think of Harry Truman's presidency, and you think of a president who makes civil rights an important part of his campaign objectives. And that too is a kind of part of the story of World War II. The changing face of the Democratic Party from the Great Depression through World War II, where you have more and more folks from outside of the South who are affiliated with the Democratic Party. You have a majority of the black population in America now voting Democratic. The National Democratic Party is changing dramatically because of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, because of what took place during World War II. And now you have the National Democratic Party and its leader advocating civil rights. For Southerners, the handwriting was on the wall. For white Southerners, anyhow, about what was going to take place.
I guess you could say that to some extent the same thing about Earl Long in Louisiana, right?
Right. I mean, when you look at Earl Long's career, he's kind of goes down as someone who was, realized that you can't deny people basic rights. And Earl Long recognized, hey, the blacks who vote in Louisiana, they vote for me. Why not make sure they gain access to the right to vote? And if you look at Earl Long's time as governor, you see this increase in black suffrage across Louisiana. It was, just something where he felt they're going to vote for me anyway. Might as well go ahead and allow this to happen. And of course, the few reforms that he made in that regard, Earl Long, he faced ferocious opposition. And especially when you think of, Earl Long in relation to guys like a Willie Raynack or a Leander Perez, who have this reputation for being these staunch segregationists. When Earl Long starts at least being sympathetic to the black community, he faces just ferocious opposition. And it's not unique to Louisiana. You think of any politician in the South after World War II who demonstrated at least an open-mindedness about certain aspects of the civil rights struggle, they very quickly lose political office. I think of Claude Pepper over in Florida. He advocated getting rid of the poll tax by federal legislation. The next time he's up for re-election, he loses. Frank Graham in North Carolina, same exact story, was soft on civil rights. And, he loses his re-election bid. And it was a very common thing for politicians to belittle their opponents in the South. And this guy is soft on civil rights. And, that's a concern that doesn't emerge. And you don't see that a lot in Southern campaigns until this World War II, post-World War II era, when now it's an issue that, is so important to a lot of white Southern politicians that they use it if they're in political trouble. Let's throw out the race card and emphasize, how we need to maintain segregation and belittle your opponent. He's soft on civil rights. And that was, the political climate in the South changes dramatically. And it's hard to deny that those changes are a direct result of the changes that take place within American society during World War II, within the black community during World War II. It kind of, the momentum behind change is enormous. And the conservative white Southern politicians are trying to prevent that change and slow that change from taking place. They're trying to hold on, but momentum is just passing them by. Time is passing them by.
This is kind of a what-if question, but you've done a lot of work on civil rights legislation. Do you think it would have come as quickly without the war?
No, I mean, there's no way it would have come as quickly, because even in the war, during the war itself, there were civil rights related issues that were kind of on the agenda, but those were defeated, and defeated fairly easily. But once the war is over, just the Northern opinion itself in favor of civil rights, at least in terms of congressional representation, you start to see more and more Northern politicians now, after the war, are much more open to some type of civil rights legislation passing in America. And you see the numbers in favor of shutting off Southern filibusters increasing year to year after World War II, and the numbers are growing steadily. And the handwriting is on the wall. If you look at the period before World War II, when you look at votes to shut off Southern filibusters in the Senate, I mean, they can't get close to the number they need to shut off those filibusters. But you see from World War II on, those numbers really start to go up pretty quick. Not fast enough, but they still went up at a continual pace. So it really, you can look at World War II as that critical catalyst. It's the critical mass in America's history. Because when you think about what happens after World War II, you have to kind of also include the storyline of the Cold War. And we go right from fighting the Nazis, fighting the Japanese, to being locked in this ideological war against the Soviet Union. And one of the easiest ways to criticize America in the early stages of the Cold War was our mistreatment of the black population in America. It was one of the things that the communists regularly hurled at America. You talk about all these rights and freedoms and democracy that you give your people, but that's not true now, is it? And you could just point to all the racial oppression in America. And that's also a part of the storyline. It's a direct result of World War II, is the Cold War situation, and so is this momentum behind civil rights, when it's not just the moral implications, but it's the broader implications of how things like racial segregation look in the eyes of the world at a time when we're trying to convey the greatness of America compared to the Soviet Union and communism. We have to clean up our house, and that's part of the rhetoric that's employed as well for advocating change in America, is simply because of that. We need to live up to the image which we are trying to project to the world.
This was not on the list that I sent you, but it's been rattling around my head, so I'm going to ask it, and you can answer it however you like. In the 20s, there is a kind of loosening up of a lot of strictures on American life that takes place. We get the notion of the Roaring 20s. Mm-hmm. Certainly women are more liberated. Women get the vote. There is a loosening of kind of the Victorian attitudes towards sexuality and all this sort of stuff. Blacks who had participated in World War I don't share in that. They don't seem to benefit much from World War I, but they do from World War II. What do you think makes the difference?
I think the difference is time. And it's the time in which those wars took place. Yes, there's a loosening of cultural mores, or change in cultural mores, and a change in values in America, following World War I. But we need to kind of keep in mind when ideas like some of the work of Franz Boas and some of those anthropologists who really start emphasizing the idea that things like race are not factors that determine everything you can do in life. You know, when you look at World War I, that's still in the racialist worldview, where most Americans accepted the idea that race was a factor determining your success and your ability to do anything in American life. And by the time you get to World War II, you have more and more folks embracing the modern, kind of modernist racial ideology, where it's more acceptable. You know, folks accept the notion that culture is, you know, what defines race. And race is really a cultural phenomenon, a historical phenomenon, but not something that necessarily delimits one's ability to achieve. And I think a large part of it has to do with the societies that exist at the time. During World War I in the teens and 20s, I mean, you have a situation where it's universally accepted amongst Americans that racial distinctions are real, and they're more than just outward manifestations of skin color, that they go to the very nature of intelligence and all that. And I think as you proceed during the course of the 20th century, you get more and more folks embracing this idea of, well, maybe that's not really the case. You know, maybe culture is what creates our definition of race. Maybe there are other things that create our definition of race, and that tends to open doors up, which were just not available during World War I. And of course, we're just thinking in terms of simple numbers. Numerically, you know, you see a much larger number of African Americans serving in World War II than World War I. So there's just more people with that experience. And, you know, they're returning back to an America that's going through profound changes. And, you know, they arrive at a time when the nation's going through this sea change, and, you know, the time to challenge culture and challenge convention is just more ripe at that point. Well, that's my stab at the answer. I don't think there's a good one for that.
Well, one thing that strikes me is that you could look at Woodrow Wilson, you know, who is certainly a forward-thinking progressive in many respects, but who still had the standard racial idea, and compare him with Truman,
right,
a couple of decades later, who's considered enough of a moderate that now both Republicans and Democrats look back to him as a kind of hero figure.
Right.
But yet he's embracing racial change.
Right, and you know, when you look at the 1920s, I always think of Calvin Coolidge, because it was, you know, Calvin Coolidge who actually came out publicly, and it was in his inaugural address, where Calvin Coolidge, as part of his address, criticizes the practice of lynching, and says, you know, we need to stop this abominable practice in American life. And he was pretty open about, you know, his sentiments regarding that particular type of crime. So, you know, there were folks who had an awakening, but like you mentioned, it's not till Harry Truman when you really start to see, you know, a president who embraces civil rights. When you have a guy like Woodrow Wilson, I mean, Woodrow Wilson obviously gets credit for some progressive ideas, but he was always kind of a Johnny-come-lately to the social justice brand of progressivism. It's, I'm up for re-election. Well, I better make sure I establish my bona fides as a social justice progressive so I can win. And then he kind of goes back to who he was. He brings a lot of Southerners to Washington, and they get appointed to throughout the government bureaucracy, and they bring segregation to the federal bureaucracy with them. And it was just part of, you know, the climate of national opinion. And you think of the 1920s, you think of the flapper, but you also think of the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan at the same time. And, you know, it's an organization where, you know, its heyday is the 1920s. And there's all those images that you'll see of the Klan rallies in the nation's capital, with the Capitol as the background and Klansmen marching down the streets of Washington without opposition. It's not like when you see a Klan rally today, when there'll be 3 Klansmen and 300 people protesting the 3 Klansmen holding their rallies. Anyway.
All right.
Excellent. All right.